All right, let's just dive right into this. Welcome back to another Explainer. Today, we're doing a deep dive, both historical and technical, into one of the absolute most pivotal moments of the 20th century, the December 7th, 1941 attack on Pearl Harbor. We aren't just going to look at the what today, we want to really dissect the anatomy of this disaster. We're talking about how brilliant enemy innovation collided perfectly with, well, massive systemic blindness.
And to understand that collision, we really have to start with this incredibly chilling directive. Launch a fierce attack on the enemy's main fleet and destroy it at the opening of the war. Those are the words of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Just let that sink in for a second. This wasn't some vague concept, it was a hyper-specific, totally audacious vision. I mean, think about the sheer nerve it takes to move an entire carrier strike force 4,000 miles across the ocean, completely undetected, just to deliver this staggering first blow. It literally rewrote the rules of naval warfare.
So here's our roadmap for today. We'll be hitting 5 main areas. 1. The geopolitical collision course. 2. Yamamoto's radical strategy. 3. American blind spots. 4. The execution of the raid itself. And finally, number 5. The devastation and accountability. All right, starting us off with Section 1, the geopolitical collision course. You see, long before the first plane even left a flight deck, these massive macro-level global events were already making a clash in the Pacific pretty much inevitable. Back in 1940, the U.S. slapped an embargo on militarily useful items. By September of that year, Japan signs the Tripartite Pact with Germany and Italy, essentially linking the wars in Europe and Asia. Fast forward to mid-1941, Japan pushes into Indochina, and the U.S. responds by freezing Japanese assets and slapping on a total oil embargo. And this is huge. The absolute breaking point hits in late 1941 with the Hull Note, basically a final diplomatic demand from the U.S. for Japan to withdraw its forces from China and Indochina. Now, if you're Japan, you're heavily dependent on U.S. oil, you're facing severe shortages. So for them, this meant diplomacy had totally failed. They felt backed into a corner, making military action seem like their only real option left.
Which brings us to Section 2, Yamamoto's radical offensive strategy.
So once military action was actually on the table, Admiral Yamamoto stepped up with what can only be called a rogue innovation. Up until then, the traditional doctrine of the Japanese Navy, which really came out of their victories in the Russo-Japanese War, was strictly defensive. The standard playbook was always to just wait for the U.S. main fleet to sail to the Far East and then destroy them with battleships. But Yamamoto's plan? Exact opposite. He wanted a preemptive, wildly aggressive carrier-based air raid aimed directly at the enemy's base in Hawaii. His goal was to deal a staggering blow right at the opening bell to just crush American morale. Now, this was heavily debated. The Japanese Naval General Staff thought it was way too risky, but Yamamoto was so committed, he literally threatened to resign if they didn't adopt his radical vision.
Actually pulling this off technically, though, that was a whole different beast. Yamamoto's prime targets were the American battleships moored at Pearl Harbor. But here's the catch. Pearl Harbor is notoriously shallow. We're talking only about 12 meters deep. Standard aerial torpedoes dropped from planes would just plunge straight into the harbor mud and be completely useless. So the Japanese had to engineer this critical technological workaround, the shallow water torpedo. What they did was fit standard torpedoes with these special wooden fin-shaped attachments. This meant they could be dropped at a super low altitude and run just under the water's surface without getting stuck in the mud. Without this one specific innovation, targeting those battleships would have been literally impossible.
Moving on to Section 3, American bureaucracy and blind spots.
So, while Japan was over there heavily innovating, the United States was dealing with some pretty severe bureaucratic friction. To look at this, we're relying on the 1995 Dorn Report. It was commissioned by the Department of Defense, and it gives us a really fascinating impartial look at accountability. One huge piece of evidence it points out is the so-called war warning that was sent to Admiral Husband D. Kimmel and General Walter C. Short in Hawaii on November 27th. But you know what? The warning was incredibly ambiguous. Sure, it said negotiations were stalemated and hostile action was possible, but it specifically suggested an attack would probably happen way out in the Western Pacific, places like the Philippines or Borneo. Washington simply didn't expect Hawaii to be attacked, and because of that, neither did Kimmel or Short.
And man, there were just so many crucial missed signals and bureaucratic failures leading up to the day. For starters, officials in Washington actually had access to magic code intercepts that strongly hinted Hawaii was a target. They even had intercepted instructions for Japanese spies to map the exact locations of ships at Pearl Harbor, but they withheld this information from the commanders in Hawaii. On top of that, you had this massive lack of coordination between the Army and the Navy, mainly thanks to intense bureaucratic rivalries. And tactically speaking, Because Admiral Kimmel assumed the main threat was local sabotage rather than a massive aerial armada, he kept the Hawaiian fleet in port, with their bows pointed out toward the entrance. He thought, hey, this'll let us leave quickly if we need to. But instead, it was a tragic miscalculation that kept the ships perfectly bunched together, like sitting ducks.
Let's get into Section 4, Execution of the Raid. The execution of this raid required a level of logistical complexity that is honestly hard to wrap your head around. First off, the Japanese task force leaves Hitokapu Bay on November 26th. Then, they cross 4,000 miles of completely empty, treacherous ocean using a storm-tossed northern route. Why? To completely avoid commercial shipping and stay entirely off the radar. Finally, they get into position about 230 nautical miles north of Hawaii and launch that first wave of 183 planes on the morning of December 7th. Just think about the discipline and skill it takes to coordinate over 150 planes per wave taking off from carrier decks in 1941, right after crossing thousands of miles of ocean in total radio silence. It was a completely unprecedented military feat, and it caught the American military entirely off guard.
And finally, Section 5, Devastation and Accountability.
2,403. That is the exact number of American service members and civilians who were killed in action during the attack. It's a stark, heavy number, and it's one that permanently altered the course of history because it instantly ended American isolationism and shoved the United States squarely into the Second World War.
Now, when we actually break down the tactical damage to the U.S. Pacific Fleet, the numbers tell a story of horrific immediate destruction, for sure, but also of incredible resilience. 12 ships were damaged and repaired. 5 ships were sunk, but miraculously, they were raised and repaired to fight again. In the end, only 3 ships were a total unrecoverable loss. So while Yamamoto absolutely succeeded in targeting 8 battleships and causing absolute chaos, he didn't permanently wipe out the fleet. Plus, a huge factor here, none of the U.S. aircraft carriers were even in port that day.
But, we really can't talk about the damage without focusing on the absolute devastation of the USS Arizona. It really serves as the emotional and historical anchor of this entire attack. The Arizona was struck by a massive 2,000-pound bomb that penetrated the deck and exploded right in her forward ammunition magazines. The resulting explosion was just cataclysmic. It instantly destroyed the ship, leaving 1,177 men entombed within her hull. It's just an absolutely unfathomable loss of life for a single moment.
In the wake of a disaster like this, the immediate human reaction is always to look for someone to blame, right? And for decades, Admiral Kimmel and General Short really bore the brunt of the public's vilification. But that 1995 Dorn Report we've been referencing, it concludes, quite impartially, that responsibility for disaster of this magnitude really has to be broadly shared. Yes, the commanders on the ground made errors in judgment with the resources they had, but pinning the entire stigma and obloquy on just those 2 guys, it completely ignores the massive bureaucratic failures, the withheld intelligence back in Washington, and frankly, the sheer unprecedented scale of the Japanese attack itself.
Which leads us with this final, pre-thought-provoking question. When a catastrophe is the result of both brilliant enemy innovation and massive systemic blindness, how should history truly assign blame? It's something historians and military strategists are still debating today. Well, I really hope this explainer helped clarify the complex anatomy of the Pearl Harbor attack for you and gave you a bit of a deeper understanding of the forces at play on December 7th, 1941. Thanks so much for learning with me today, and I definitely encourage you to keep exploring this fascinating piece of history on your own.